Okay, moving right along, I'm going to invite to the stage the 6 panellists now who form the balance of voices from Australia and the world. And to let you know, as Jonathan Mills, the director of the Edinburgh International Festival, Dr. Manju Prakash, the Assistant Secretary General, Federation of Indian Chamber of Commerce and Industry, Mr. Murray Green, former Director of ABC International, His Excellency Mr. Imron Cotan, Indonesian Ambassador to the People's Republic of China, Ms. Barbara Livesey, former Chief Executive Director of Reconciliation Australia, and Dato Michael Yeoh, Chairman of the World Chinese Economic Forum and CEO of the Asian Strategy and Leadership Institute. Would you please come and join us on the stage? Thank you. Would you welcome our visitors? 5 of these 6 contributors have travelled specifically to Australia to take part in our summit today. You're most welcome.
Good to see you, please.
Hello. Good to see you. You sit in there. Okay, Maria, would you like to call first cab off the rank? We don't need to formally reintroduce people, but to say that we've deliberately mixed up Australian and international voices in this session of voices from Australia and the world, to hear briefly from each of our contributors and then to open the dialogue. Maria.
Thank you. Well, I think my theme is really getting personal. What do you think personally? What is your advice? And the idea here is to take your professional and personal perspective. So I think really I don't need to contribute. I will just start from my left, or should we go for the running order? What would you like? Start with Jonathan?
Jonathan.
So, Jonathan...
Yes, very happy to start.
I think just last night you were talking about your role being overseas, some 8 years, and your perspective of what you see is portrayed as Australians. And you talked quite openly about it's time to grow up and participate. So please, we'd love to hear from you.
Thank you. Can I be heard? Is this on? Good, very good. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to be very brief because we've got a lot of people to get through. I'm delighted to be here. I'm delighted by the challenge of the topic itself. I think the question of Asia and Australia is one that is of very great length and very great duration. But to be actually asking the question of Australia and its relevance in an Asian century is something that is very timely and it is very relevant to us all. I would like to contribute several thoughts. There's many that I have that are already been stated today. But I think there's one very important thing to understand about any relationship in Asia, and it's the symbolism. It's not just about pragmatism. When Wen Jiabao recently said that he was frustrated at the role that China was playing or not playing in the IMF, in the World Bank, in many multilateral organizations, he was also expressing a frustration about the way in which Chinese culture had not captured the world's attention in the way that, say, American popular culture had actually captured that attention. There is an enormous effort going on, an enormous global effort going on behalf of the Chinese government to actually recapture that particular dialogue, that particular effort. And I think that it is very important for all of you as corporate leaders, as leaders of public and private institutions, to understand that this will require much more than an instrumental approach on our behalf of thinking ourselves as the food bowl of the practical opportunities that we can offer. It requires a joined-up thinking and a coordinated action where public and private entrepreneurship join together, and where we recognise the institutional capacity as well as the private person-to-person capacity that we have. It will require a huge shift of cultural thinking within our organisations. If I compare what we did in the 60s to the 80s, where, as Ken Henry pointed out, in 1960, 40% of people leaving schools learnt Asian languages as opposed to 14% today. Where in the mid-70s, a public broadcasting organisation like SBS was established, and where a generation before that, the ANU established one of the really great research schools, the Research School of Pacific and Asian Studies. I want to know what those opportunities are for our Asian century. I want them to be much more engaged and much more relevant and much more used and called upon in this broad public debate. We are at a crossroads, and I think it's the symbolism as well as the pragmatism that needs to be thought about. As an artist myself, I would suggest to you that where you are now, the territory that you are now occupying has been occupied by artists for generations before you. When you think about Australia and an Asian century, think about the engagement of artists like Peter Sculthorpe and Richard Mille. Think about the Asian collections, the extraordinary Asian collections at the Art Gallery of New South Wales, the National Gallery of Victoria, the National Gallery of Australia. One of the great diplomatic efforts that I saw in Asia recently was the Sari to Sarong collection that went from the National Gallery of Australia. A brilliant exposition of technology and craft. Let's not narrow our focus. Let's not misread this opportunity. Let's make sure that Australia in an Asian century is a culturally enriched and culturally engaged opportunity. In his book, The Australian Moment, George Megalogenis says that we're great in adversity, but we really haven't quite cracked how to build for a sustainable success for ourselves. I don't agree with everything he says, but I think he's got a kernel of a point. We've got to be much more mature, we've got to be much more sophisticated, and we've got to understand not just the practical dimensions of this argument, but the powerful symbolic dimensions of this. We're entering a period where no particular and no single culture will dominate the world. It's not about Asia as opposed to Europe, it's a parallel universe. And in that parallel universe, Australia is perfectly poised. The tyranny of distance has given way to the power of proximity. Let's use it wisely.
Thank you, Jonathan. I think the idea of speed dating is you want more, so wonderful kickoff. I'm going to go to Murray. Murray, last night I spoke to Bruce Dover, who has, I think, your old role. And Bruce talked about a Chinese insight to wanting to understand why Australians fire volunteers are volunteers and why our lifesavers are volunteers, wanting to understand what is Australia. Now, from ABC Radio National, 75 years in operating within our Asian region. So what are your thoughts on this, Murray?
Maria, thank you, and good morning, everyone. I come at this from the perspective of leading over the last 5 years the ABC's international engagement. And the ABC's international engagement is not something that's a discretionary fringe activity, but is at the heart of the Charter. Clearly, the ABC has got to broadcast domestically, but also at the heart of the Charter is the responsibility to engage in the neighbourhood and broadcast internationally. I certainly don't speak for the ABC now, as I left a few weeks ago, but I come with the reflection of those last 5 years, and also just out of a recent visit to Myanmar, where I was working with UNESCO on assisting with some of the media development in terms of legal reform to some of the press law. And Myanmar has been under some 50 years of military rule in one form or other, and suddenly it's decided that the requirement that anything that's published has to have prior state approval, this is now about to be lifted. And the transition that is taking place in economies such as Myanmar are absolutely dramatic, and Australia is in there making a contribution. But my perspective is, while we have a role and a strong voice and strong opportunities in the Asian century. We're there in some of the big cities, whether it's Bangkok, whether it's Shanghai, whether it's Delhi or Jakarta. We're there as one of many, many voices. For instance, Australian Network Television is one of some 700 channels in India. So there are a lot of voices, a lot of things to be said, a lot of media space to actually engage in, but we are one of many voices. And I guess when I reflect on the past 4 or 5 years, one of the things that is quite apparent to me is that while we can make a very strong contribution in the Asian context, I think we can be quite transformational in terms of our engagement in the Pacific. And I think we're going to be myopic if we just focus on the Asian century without seeing the Pacific century as being part of that engagement. And I'd like to take you to 3 places in terms of my recent experience in terms of engagement in the Pacific, just to give you some idea of the impact and the opportunities for transformation that we have. Let's first of all go to Honiara, where if you go to one of the bus stations, there are a lot of kids hanging around, and these are primary school kids who have decided not to go to school anymore. So they hang around with their ghetto blasters and having a good time. And we came across, in shooting our Pacific program for Australian Network, Pacific Pulse, a little guy called Charlie, who decided to break out of that melee and take some of his mates down to the river, and they wash cars in the river. And some of the Ramsey vehicles, the Regional Assistance Mission to the Solomon Islands, the security forces there had their vehicles being washed there too. And this little 10-year-old guy decided to get his mates, who lived also in the bush near the river, and they embarked upon this activity. Here was an opportunity for us to actually engage through the media in terms of connecting the experience of these kids with the opportunities for learning and education. English language learning is absolutely critical in terms of our output in the region. The second place I'd like to take you is to the children's section of the Port Moresby Cemetery, where we were doing a story in relation to a number of women who had lost their children through HIV infection. They couldn't be shown on television. John Bean, who tragically lost his life in the Lake Eyre helicopter crash last year, was our cameraman. And he shot so sensitively, far away but so near. And the story of the challenges of these women and the big public health challenges that are in the Pacific were part of our agenda. The third place I'd like to take you to is Port Vila in Vanuatu. Here, Digicel, the mobile phone company, introduced a mobile phone that you didn't have to charge by actually charging it with electricity. You just put it in the sun and it charged itself. This was the most dramatic innovation in the processes of democracy in Vanuatu. For suddenly all the villages became connected. They were previously silent. They didn't contribute to the talkback radio programs, and suddenly with the introduction of the solar charged mobile, they became participants in the democratic process. What I'm saying to you is that we need to engage in the Asian century and be fully part of it, but let's also engage in the transformational opportunities as part of that engagement in the Pacific.
Thank you, Murray. It's a theme of caring